The German ACES laughed at the P-51 Mustang. They called it a mediocre performer. Nothing to worry about. Then on March 6, 1944, 209 of them appeared over Berlin, and the laughter stopped forever. This isn't just a story about one remarkable airplane. It's a story about a deadly, fundamental problem that was costing thousands of American lives and threatening to derail the entire Allied war strategy. The bomber mafia's vision. In the late 1930s, a group of Air Corps officers at the Air Corps Tactical School had developed a revolutionary theory. They called themselves, unofficially, the Bomber Mafia. Men like Curtis LeMay, Haywood Hansel, and Ira Eaker believed that strategic bombing could win wars without the need for massive ground invasions. Their vision was precise, surgical, devastating. Using the top-secret Norden bomb site, a mechanical computer so classified that bomber crews guarded it with their lives, they would fly in broad daylight and destroy the industrial heart of Nazi Germany. Not cities, not civilians, but the ball-bearing factories, the synthetic oil plants, the aircraft assembly lines that fed Hitler's war machine. It was a beautiful theory. On paper it would save countless lives. But in the winter of 1943, as the frost settled over the airfields of England, that theory was being written in blood across the skies of Germany. The gap of death. Late 1943. The U.S. 8th Air Force, based in the damp fields of England, was being bled white over the skies of Germany. The workhorses of the bombing campaign, the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, were magnificent machines. Tough, bristling with .50 caliber machine guns, flown by crews of incredibly brave young men. The theory was that these flying fortresses could defend themselves by flying in tight combat boxes, creating an interlocking field of fire that would shred any attacking fighter. But the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, had perfected their defenses. They were fighting over their own homes. They were experts, and they were patient. You see, our bombers did have fighter escorts. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a beast tough as nails, a brilliant fighter. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, fast with twin engines that gave pilots a sense of security. But both were what pilots called short-legged. They were thirsty machines designed for tactical war over the battlefields of France. They simply did not have the fuel to fly all the way to targets deep inside Germany. They could only protect the bombers for the first few hundred miles. Then their fuel gauges would hit the red, and the fighter pilots had to make a terrible choice. Peel off and head for home, leaving the bombers alone and defenseless for the most dangerous part of the mission. Staff Sergeant Robert Rosie Rosenthal, a B-17 pilot with the 100th Bomb Group, the Bloody 100th, later described that moment. You'd see your little friends wag their wings. That was goodbye. Then you'd watch them dive away, getting smaller and smaller until they disappeared. And you knew. For the next 2 hours, you were absolutely on your own. The intercom would go quiet. Every man on that plane was thinking the same thing. This is where they get us. Can you imagine that feeling? You're 5 miles up. The temperature is minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Your breath freezes inside your oxygen mask. And you watch your only protection disappear into the distance. Black Week. The Germans called this calculated kill zone the Todeslücke, the death gap. Their Jägerschwader, their fighter wings, would gather their forces and wait. As soon as the escorts left, they would pounce. They attacked in waves, sometimes 100 fighters at a time, flying through the bomber formations in head-on attacks, 20mm cannons blazing. They knew exactly what they were doing. A Bf-109 approaching head-on at a closing speed of 600 miles per hour gave a bomber's nose gunner maybe 2 seconds to react. Often, the German pilots would aim for the cockpit, killing both pilots instantly. The B-17 would nose over and spiral down, taking 10 men with it. The loss rates were simply staggering. During what became known as Black Week, in October 1943, the 8th Air Force launched 2 raids on Schweinfurt to destroy Germany's ball-bearing plants, components essential for every tank, truck, and aircraft in the Reich. On October 14, 1943, 291 B-17s took off. 60 never came back. That's 600 men, dead, wounded, or prisoners of war, in a single day. The B-17s that did make it home often looked like flying scrap metal. Wings shot full of holes. Hydraulics leaking. Dead and dying men in the waist gun positions. The Air Force calculated that a bomber crew needed to complete 25 missions to finish their tour and go home. But the math was brutal. With loss rates at 20%, A crew's statistical chance of surviving 25 missions was less than 1 in 20. In other words, if you were a 20-year-old kid from Iowa climbing into AB-17 in the fall of 1943, you were statistically already dead. One navigator, later interviewed, said, "We didn't talk about if we'd get hit. We talked about when. And we made dark jokes about it because what else could you do? You either laughed or you went crazy." The air war was being lost not for lack of courage, but for a devastating lack of range. The impossible problem. This created a problem that military planners and aircraft designers had insisted was fundamentally impossible to solve. The physics were unforgiving. A fighter, by definition, had to be light, fast, and nimble to dogfight a Bf-109 or Focke-Wulf 190. But to fly 1,000 miles round trip, it needed massive fuel tanks, which made it heavy, sluggish, basically a flying target. You couldn't have both. Every engineer knew this. It was an engineering paradox written in the laws of physics. And as 1943 came to a close, the solution was nowhere in sight. The one plane that could have been the answer, the North American P-51 Mustang, was sitting in hangars in North Africa, dismissed by almost everyone as a failure. Where was the Mustang? If you had mentioned the P-51 Mustang to a Luftwaffe ace in 1943, he likely would have dismissed it, if he'd even heard of it. If you'd mentioned it to a weary American bomber pilot, he'd have given you a blank stare. The plane existed, but it was a phantom in the one place it was needed most. It was floating in the margins of the war. A footnote. Certainly not a war winner. The reason for this goes back to its very beginning. Born from desperation. The P-51 wasn't even built for the U.S. Army Air Forces. It was born from a desperate British request in April 1940. The Royal Air Force was fighting for its life during the Battle of Britain. They needed fighters, any fighters, and they needed them fast. The British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation, a company known more for trainers than high-performance fighters. They asked them to build the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk under license. Just copy an existing design and start cranking them out. The head of North American, a brilliant and famously gruff engineer named James Howard Dutch Kindleberger, looked at the P-40 design and in so many words said, "We can do better." His chief designer, Edgar Schmud, a German immigrant who had left his homeland in the 1930s, had been quietly sketching ideas for a revolutionary fighter. Schmud had worked for Fokker in Germany and Messerschmitt before emigrating to America. He understood European fighter design philosophy in ways most American engineers didn't. Kindleberger before pulling up just above the treetops. It was terrifying work. Ground fire could shred you, but pilots loved the plane's ruggedness and speed. One A-36 pilot, Lieutenant Michael T. Russo, later said, "That airplane could take a beating. I came back once with 40 holes in the wings and fuselage. She got me home." But the A-36 wasn't the high-altitude savior the bomber crews were praying for. As far as the war over Germany was concerned, the Mustang was a dead end. The plane that looked like a thoroughbred was performing like a plow horse. And the gap of death remained wide open. The man who saw the solution. But a few sharp-eyed engineers, one in particular, had a different idea. They believed the problem wasn't the plane. Was the engine. The British masterpiece. While the P-51 languished in secondary theaters, the British had their own legendary fighter, the Supermarine Spitfire. And the heart of the Spitfire was a true masterpiece of engineering, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The Merlin wasn't just good. It was, without question, the finest high-altitude piston engine in the world. Its secret was a revolutionary two-stage, two-speed supercharger. Think of it as a transmission for the engine's breathing system. As the Spitfire climbed into thin air, the supercharger would shift into a higher gear, continuing to force-feed the engine with compressed oxygen. Where the Allison would be gasping for breath, the Merlin would be breathing just fine. At 25,000 feet, a Merlin-powered Spitfire could produce over 1,500 horsepower. The Allison, at the same altitude, was struggling to make 900. The memo that changed everything. In April 1942, a British test pilot named Ronald Harker was given a chance to fly one of the early Allison-powered Mustangs at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. Harker climbed into the cockpit, fired up the engine and took off. At low altitude he was deeply impressed. The plane was fast, responsive, beautifully balanced. But then he climbed to 20,000 feet and the performance fell off a cliff. It was like flying a different airplane, sluggish, underpowered. When he landed, Harker immediately wrote a memo to his superiors. It was short, direct, and brilliant. Put a Merlin in that American airframe. On paper it sounded simple. In reality, it was a transatlantic engineering nightmare. The Allison V1710 and the Rolls-Royce Merlin were completely different engines. Different dimensions. Different mounting points. Different cooling requirements. The Merlin, with its complex two-stage supercharger, ran significantly hotter and needed larger radiators. Fitting it into the Mustang's sleek airframe would require re-engineering the entire front half of the airplane. Teams from Rolls-Royce and North American Aviation worked together across thousands of miles. Remember, this was 1942. No email, no Zoom calls, just telegrams, letters, and a lot of very expensive phone calls. They had to redesign the engine mounts, enlarge the air intakes, reconfigure the cooling system. The belly scoop, the distinctive radiator intake under the fuselage, had to be completely reworked. Engineers even discovered a beneficial side effect. The radiator design created what became known as the Meredith effect, where the heated exhaust air actually added a small amount of forward thrust. They had accidentally created a tiny jet engine effect. It was a huge risk. They could have easily created a Frankenstein's monster, an airplane that was heavy, unbalanced, and worse than the original. The resurrection. In late 1942, they took 5 P-51A airframes, ripped out the Allison engines, and somehow managed to shoehorn in the new Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engines, later produced under license by Packard in America as the V1650. These prototypes were designated XP-51B. The first test flight took place on November 30, 1942, at the North American Aviation Plant in Inglewood, California. Company test pilot Bob Chilton climbed to altitude, opened the throttle, and radioed back to the ground. His words, according to those who heard the transmission, were unprintable but ecstatic. Here are the numbers that changed the war. Speed at 30,000 feet. The old Allison-powered P-51A could do about 390 miles per hour. The new Merlin-powered P-51B could do 440 miles per hour. That's not a 10 miles per hour improvement, it's a 50 miles per hour leap, and at altitude, that made it faster than anything else in the sky. Rate of climb. The P-51B could climb at over 3,500 feet per minute at sea level and maintain strong climb performance all the way up to 30,000 feet. It could outclimb a Bf-109 and match a Focke-Wulf 190. Ceiling. Absolute ceiling was over 41,000 feet. It could go higher than the bombers it was protecting, which meant it could always have the altitude advantage in combat. The transformation was complete. By combining the most aerodynamically advanced airframe in the world with the best high-altitude engine in the world, they had, through a combination of American design and British engineering, created the perfect long-range thoroughbred. The mediocre mud mover was dead. In its place stood the weapon that would finally allow the 8th Air Force to take the fight all the way to Berlin, solving the range problem. But there was still a problem. Now they had a fighter that could perform brilliantly at 30,000 feet. It was fast, it could climb, it handled like a sports car. But this solved only half the crisis. The original problem, the one that was killing hundreds of men every week, wasn't just speed at altitude. It was range. How do you get this new hot rod, with its powerful but thirsty Merlin engine, from a rainy airfield in England to the skies over Berlin and back? That's over 1,100 miles round trip, an unheard-of distance for a single-engine fighter. This is where the genius of Edgar Schmidt's original design paid off in a way no one could have anticipated. Remember that laminar flow wing? Less drag means less fuel burned. The Mustang, by its very nature, was remarkably fuel-efficient. It sipped fuel where the P-47 Thunderbolt gulped it. But even that incredible efficiency wasn't enough to reach Berlin. The engineers needed more fuel capacity. The problem was the wings were already packed full of fuel tanks, ammunition, guns, and landing gear. There was no more room. Their solution was bold and, frankly, dangerous. If they couldn't add fuel in the wings, they put it in the fuselage. They installed a massive 85-gallon fuel tank directly behind the pilot's seat, in the space where, on most fighters, there was just empty air or radio equipment. Pilots were immediately wary. One P-51 pilot, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer, later said, "When they told us about that fuselage tank, our first thought was, you want us to sit on a bomb? One cannon hit back there and you'd never know what killed you." And there was another problem. When that rear tank was full, it made the plane dangerously tail-heavy. The center of gravity shifted backwards. The Mustang became unstable, difficult to control. Pilots had to be disciplined, fly straight and level, burn that rear tank down first, then engage in combat. But combined with two external 75-gallon drop tanks slung under the wings, this system gave them the one thing they needed more than anything: time. Put all the pieces together. The efficient, low-drag laminar flow wing. The powerful high-altitude Merlin engine. Standard internal fuel, 184 gallons in the wings. Two 75-gallon drop tanks. 150 gallons jettisoned when empty or when entering combat. The new 85-gallon fuselage tank, 85 gallons. Total fuel capacity, 419 gallons. The math that had seemed impossible suddenly worked. The P-51 Mustang had a combat radius of over 850 miles. It could fly from England, escort the bombers all the way to Berlin, drop its empty external tanks, fight for 30 minutes over the target, and then, flying on internal fuel, escort the bombers all the way home. The gap of death was about to be closed. German overconfidence. In late 1943, the very first of these new long-range P-51 Mustangs arrived in England. They were assigned to the 354th Fighter Group, who proudly called themselves the Pioneers. And at this exact, critical moment, German intelligence made one of the greatest blunders of the war. They had heard reports of a new Mustang arriving in England, but their assessment was lazy and arrogant. They assumed it was just the same mediocre Allison-powered plane they'd encountered before, maybe with a few minor tweaks but nothing to worry about. New content, Göring's fatal miscalculation. Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring was famously dismissive of American fighter capabilities. In 1942 he had boasted, "The Americans cannot build airplanes. They are very good at refrigerators and razor blades." Even as late as January 1944, German intelligence briefs described American pilots as inferior in training and fighting spirit compared to Luftwaffe veterans. This arrogance was about to cost them everything. The Luftwaffe fighter wings, the Jagdgeschwader, were confident. Their Bf-109GS and Focke-Wulf 190s were excellent machines, flown by hardened aces, many with 50, 100, even 200 victories. They were the masters of the sky over Germany. They had no idea what was about to hit them. March 6, 1944. Now we come to the day it all changed. March 6, 1944. We came down out of the sun and I picked one, fired a 2-second burst, and he just exploded. Pieces everywhere. I went through the debris and pulled up for another pass. The Germans were scattering. Some were trying to run. We chased them all the way back to their airfield. Lieutenant Urban Ben Drew shot down 2 Bf-109s and then spotted a German jet, and Me-262, one of the first operational jet fighters in history. He chased it incredibly and managed to shoot it down as it slowed to land. It was one of the first jet kills of the war. The price? The 8th Air Force paid a terrible price that day. 69 heavy bombers were lost, nearly 700 men killed, wounded, or captured. It was an agonizing toll. But here's what mattered. For the first time, that loss rate was considered sustainable, because the price paid by the Luftwaffe was catastrophic. They lost 64 fighters. But more importantly, far more importantly, they lost dozens of their irreplaceable veteran experts. Seasoned aces who could never be replaced. Germany could still build airplanes. Their factories, despite the bombing, could churn out Bf-109s and Focke-Wulfs. But they could not replace experienced pilots. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe was already suffering from a desperate shortage of fuel for training. New pilots were getting 60 hours of flight time before being thrown into combat. American pilots were getting 200 to 300 hours, plus gunnery training, formation flying, and combat tactics. One German pilot, Johannes Steinhoff, later wrote, "After the Berlin raid, we knew the war was lost. Not because we lacked courage, but because we were sending boys up against men. And they were flying a better machine." The myth of Berlin's invincibility was shattered. The invincible Luftwaffe was bleeding out. This single mission, on this single day, proved that the P-51 Mustang was the weapon that would finally, decisively win the war in the air. The P-51D, perfection. The P-51B had saved the air war. But as any engineer or mechanic knows, the first version of anything is never the final version. Pilots were grateful for the B model, but they had complaints, serious, life-threatening complaints. The biggest was the razorback fuselage. The pilot sat low in the cockpit, and the high metal spine behind his head created a massive blind spot. In a swirling dogfight, what you can't see is exactly what kills you. A German fighter could slip into that blind spot, and the first warning you'd have would be cannon shells tearing through your wings. North Americans' engineers listened. Their solution would create the most iconic fighter silhouette of World War II. They completely redesigned the rear fuselage, cutting down that high spine to almost nothing. Then they fitted a smooth, single-piece bubble canopy, a clear plexiglass dome that slid back on rails. The change was immediate and profound. The pilot now had a complete 360-degree view. He could check his tail, simply by turning his head. In aerial combat, this advantage cannot be overstated. It was the difference between hunting and being hunted. One pilot said it felt like fighting in a glass house. You could see everything. Better teeth. But they didn't just improve the visibility. They upgraded the plane's weapons. The 4.50 caliber machine guns on the P-51B were effective, but they had a fatal flaw. The guns were mounted at an angle in the wings, and their ammunition feed system was complex. In a hard high-G turn, the kind you always pull in a dogfight, the ammo belts would kink and the guns would jam. Imagine lining up the perfect killing shot on an enemy fighter, squeezing the trigger, and nothing. Click. Jam. The P-51D fixed this. They added 2 more guns for a total of 6.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 3 per wing. But more importantly, they completely redesigned the feed system. The guns were now mounted upright, and the ammunition fed straight in. Simple. Reliable. Virtually jam-proof. A 2-second burst from 6 heavy machine guns put out 1,200 rounds of armor-piercing and incendiary ammunition. It was devastating. German fighters would often disintegrate in midair, wings torn off, fuel tanks exploding. The gyroscopic gunsight. And there was one more piece of technology, something that seemed almost like magic. The K-14 gyroscopic gunsight. Before this, hitting a maneuvering target in 3-dimensional space was incredibly difficult. A pilot had to lead the target, aiming where the enemy would be, not where he was. It required instinct, experience, and a lot of luck. Most fighter pilots expended thousands of rounds for every kill. The K-14 changed that. It was a simple analog computer mounted behind the windscreen. The pilot would dial in the target's wingspan, say 33 feet for a Bf-109, and use his rudder pedals to bracket the target's wings in the reticle. The gunsight's internal gyroscope would automatically calculate the correct lead angle, accounting for speed, turn rate, and gravity. A little illuminated diamond would appear in the sight, showing exactly where to aim. This made average pilots good and good pilots absolutely lethal. Kill-to-expenditure ratios improved dramatically. One ace, Major George Preddy, scored 6 kills in a single day using the K-14 sight, an almost unheard-of feat. So now look at what they had created. The low-drag laminar flow wing for efficiency. The powerful Merlin engine for high-altitude speed. The bubble canopy for 360-degree vision. 6 reliable, hard-hitting machine guns. A computer-assisted gun sight. The P-51D was the perfect predator. The spring of 1944. These new P-51DS began arriving in England in massive numbers during the spring of 1944, just as the Allies were frantically preparing for D-Day. By June 6, 1944, when the first boats hit the beaches of Normandy, the P-51D had become the primary long-range escort fighter of the 8th Air Force. The failure of 1942 was now the most advanced, most feared, and most important fighter in the world. The final chapter for the Luftwaffe. The final, brutal chapter for the Luftwaffe began in earnest after D-Day. The air war intensified to a fever pitch. The Allies needed absolute air superiority over France, and the P-51 was the tool to achieve it. But the Luftwaffe's problem was no longer just facing a superior machine. It was a devastating mathematical problem of attrition. By mid-1944, Germany's pilot training program had completely collapsed. Fuel shortages meant student pilots got minimal flight time. Experienced instructors had been pulled back to combat units to fill gaps. New Luftwaffe pilots were being thrown into combat with 50 to 60 hours of total flight time, barely enough to take off and land safely. Who were they fighting? American pilots with 300+ hours of training, including gunnery, formation flying, and advanced combat tactics. It wasn't a fair fight. It was a slaughter. One German pilot interviewed after the war said, "On my first mission I was terrified. We took off, and before I even saw the bombers, 4 Mustangs came out of nowhere. My flight leader was shot down in seconds. I dove for the deck and somehow made it back. Half my squadron didn't." The hunter becomes the hunted. And Doolittle's aggressive doctrine had been taken to its logical, terrifying extreme. After the bombers completed their runs and turned for home, Mustang groups were free to hunt. They would drop from 25,000 feet down to treetop level and strafe German airfields. This tactic would have been suicidal 6 months earlier. Now, with air superiority, it was devastatingly effective. Lieutenant Colonel Elwin Rigetti described a strafing run. "We'd come in just over the trees at 400 miles per hour. You'd see the airfield, planes parked in neat rows, ground crews running for cover. You'd open up with all 6 guns, walk them across the field. Planes would explode, fuel trucks would blow up. It was over in seconds and you were gone before the flak could even track you. Imagine the terror on the ground. One moment, silence. The next, a dozen Mustangs screaming over the treeline, their .50 calibers tearing everything apart. The Luftwaffe had nowhere to run. If they flew, they died. If they stayed on the ground, they died. By the fall of 1944, the Luftwaffe, as a coherent fighting force, was finished. The war is lost. German fighter ace Adolf Galland, a brilliant tactician and one of the most respected fighter leaders of the war, stood on his airfield one day in the spring of 1944 and looked up. P-51 Mustangs were roaming freely over Berlin, unopposed, hunting. He turned to his staff and said, "Das ist das Ende. Der Krieg ist verloren." This is the end. The war is lost. He knew in that moment that they could never again stop the bombers. The Mustang had broken the back of the Luftwaffe. The numbers. The final accounting of the P-51 Mustang's contribution is staggering. By the end of the war, Mustang pilots were credited with destroying approximately 4,950 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, more than any other Allied fighter in the European theater. They destroyed another 4,131 German aircraft on the ground during strafing attacks. Those numbers represent the surgical removal of the Luftwaffe from the sky. And they were achieved in just 18 months, from early 1944 to May 1945. Did the Mustang win the war? But did the P-51 Mustang win World War II by itself? Of course not. No single weapon system ever does. That great victory was earned by infantrymen in the